So this is what you get when you order the Moto Electrics Type 1 alternator charging system kit. And it's a complete replacement of all the components. Now this is the alternator rotor and stator, and this is the rotor bolt and lock washer. And they also supply a complete stator cover, including the brushes already installed. This cover is not available from BMW anymore, and a brand new set of mounting bolts for the stator cover. And they include a diode board and 4 diode mounts for those motorcycles that used to have the rubber mounts. This is a much better solution because the rubber mounts create a number of problems. They shear off and they really don't do any good. You want solid mounts and all the mount hardware plus some extras. And this is the voltage regulator. They also include the front crankshaft seal, which is a nice touch, and some dielectric grease, and then the wires that you need to attach the alternator stator output to the diode board, the diode board output to the starter solenoid, and the alternator Y output wire, and an extra ground wire. So this is really a nice kit with all the parts you would need. So I got some other wiring from Moto Electrics. This connects to the voltage regulator and has connections that go to the alternator and the diode board, and I'll show how all that goes together a little later. And I also picked up their battery cable kit because I want to attach the positive battery cable to the starter solenoid while I do the alternator replacement. And I also got a grommet. That's what the battery plus cable goes through in the top of the inner timing cover. And it comes with some zip ties and also a little packet of dielectric grease. Now the stator has 3 wires here because the stator generates alternating current, or AC, voltage, and it has 3 phases, so there's 1 output wire for each of the 3 phases. And it also has a center tap, what's known as the Y terminal, and those have to be attached to the stator cover. So I group these 3 and run them through here, and then take the Y terminal and run it through here like that. And then this will go on that screw terminal, and these 3 will mount on these terminals, and they can go in any order, it doesn't matter. And then I'll solder them on there, and then I'll have the stator assembly ready for installation. Now before I do any soldering, I want to make sure that the stator center band slides into the cover like that, and then I can take the wires and lay them into each of the terminals. And what I like to do after I get them in, there's a little slot on the terminals. I like to take some needle nose pliers and just crimp them in a little bit so they grab onto the wires. And after I solder them, I'll trim the leads here so they're flush with the terminals. So I've got my soldering gun, and I'm got the trigger pulled, and I'm gonna make sure it's hot, and then I'll just lay it down here on top of the terminal and hold some solder against it to make sure I get some in. Okay, those are soldered, and I'll trim the leads. So I pulled off the nut the lock washer and the spade terminal on the Y post, and then I put the lead on first, and then put the little spade terminal on, and then the lock washer, and then the nut, and tighten that up with an 8mm wrench. There we go. Now the other thing I do is I'm going to tighten these up here. These are the brush spade terminals, and I just want to make sure they're good and tight as well. Now the EME alternator kit comes with a ground wire, and I mounted it under the bolt head that holds the front mount for the starter motor. Now when you look at the back of the diode board, you'll see that the lower mounting holes have rubber insulators, and that's because this whole piece of metal is carrying DC current to these terminals. Consequently, what you want to do is mount the ground wire on the upper hole, which is this post here. You want it up there, you don't want it down here. That's particularly important if your diode board is using the rubber mounts, because this will be 100% insulated and you won't be getting a ground. Now, the diode board kit came with these standoffs, which a lot of the motors use, but on my bike it didn't come with those, and the diode board mounts right there on these bushes here with an Allen bolt. So that's how I'm going to mount this one. Now the diode board has some terminals on the back. There's 3 of them here in a row, and then a little cluster of 2. Those 3 take this cable with the yellow wires, and these are going to go to the stator cover, and they carry each of the 3 AC phases into the diode board, so they'll plug in like that. Now this is the cable that goes to the voltage regulator, and the blue wire on the cable, this one right here, plugs into either of those terminals. So those I'll connect before I mount the diode board on the inner timing cover. Okay, I've got them all connected to the back of the diode board. Now the way the diode board mounts is these 2 terminals are on the right, and this one is on the left. Now the grommet here for the voltage regulator cable slides into the slot up at the top like this, and I've routed the stator cover wires back around like that, so they'll be on this side, which is where the spade terminals are for the stator that these plug into. Now there's one other wire, which is this black wire, and it goes to the solenoid on the starter relay, so I'm going to run it back behind through here like this for now. Now my diode board just mounts with 4 Allens and a wave washer, and I made sure this upper Allen, I caught the ring terminal on the ground wire, and I like to use a little Allen socket to run them in, and then when I get them snug I use a stubby little socket wrench so I don't over torque them, and just snug them up tight. I installed the yellow wire here that goes to the Y terminal on the stator cover, and I put the 90-degree connector on that particular pin, and then there's the red wire that goes to the starter solenoid, and this takes the output DC current from the diode board and essentially sends it back to the battery. So what I do is I run it through this hole, and then there's 2 size spades. This one takes the smaller one. Before I install the battery plus cable on the screw terminal of the starter solenoid, I put the rubber grommet on it with the leg pointing toward the ring terminal of the battery cable. It's easier to install the grommet if you use some dish detergent, WD-40, or tire lubricant to help it slide over the terminal and down the insulation. Now, I originally routed the red DC output wire through the hole back here, but after I looked at it, I realized it's better if I take it down low through here, and then I can route it up and over to the large screw terminal on the starter solenoid, which is where I've also attached the battery plus cable, and then there's the lock washer and the nut that go on. Now, the other wire is that black wire, which I routed through the cover, and it's going to go on to this spade terminal here. Now, I routed the black wire down so it doesn't rub up against the hose clamp for the crankcase breather hose, because I don't want it to chafe. And I also have the red wire down for the same reason, so it doesn't rub up against the starter motor and chafe. Now, in order to route the plus cable, you have to put a little bit of a loop in it and then have it come up through the grommet in the inner timing cover, which is why I installed the grommet in the direction I did, so that the little foot here is inside, and then the rebreather hose will run underneath it. So it's kind of a little bit curious that you have to put that kink in it, but the distance from the solenoid terminal to the slot in the inner timing cover is so short, you actually need to bring this out, loop it around, and then up and over, or you'll put a real serious crimp in it, which is not a good idea. Now, I put dielectric grease here on the big screw terminal on the starter solenoid to protect all of that connection from corrosion. And the other thing I did, there's a very small hole in this front grommet that would lead into the front timing cover. So I put a little silicone seal to seal it, because I don't want any rainwater or anything to get into there and cause corrosion to the electrical components inside the cover. So I'm ready to put the rotor on, and I cleaned the taper with a clean towel and some brake cleaner, and also the inside of the taper on the rotor. And then I put just a little bit of engine oil around the outside, because it's going to go up against the front crankshaft seal, and I want it to slide in easy. Then all I need to do is slide it on, and I'm going to just tap it a little, a couple of taps, and then the question is, can I turn the engine using the rotor? And if so, then those taper surfaces are absolutely clean. If it slips, then they're dirty. And mine's slipping, so it's not clean. I need to re-clean it. So I went back and used my metal polish on the crankshaft taper, and I found I had actually quite a lot of crud on there. I thought I'd cleaned it, but I guess I didn't get it clean enough, and that's not helping. And then I went back and used the brake cleaner again on the inside of the taper on the rotor and on the nose, and cleaned those several times. And now I can, if you watch the crank here, the connecting rod, see it moving? So now I can turn the engine just grabbing the rotor without the rotor bolt, and that means the tapers are absolutely perfectly clean, and it's exactly the way it should be. Now the slip rings need some cleaning, so I use the metal polish again, and you can see there was quite a bit of oxidation on those, so it's good to clean them up before you put everything together. So I'm going to put the new rotor bolt with the lock washer in, and then torque it up to about 15 foot-pounds. Now there's two sets of threads, one in the rotor and one in the crank, so when you turn it in, it'll get through the threads in the rotor, and then it'll get a little loose like that, and now you're into the threads in the crank, so you have to keep turning to tighten it up. Now I'm going to use an oil filter wrench to clamp the rotor while I torque it. And I've got my torque wrench set to 15 foot-pounds. So we'll just keep going here. Let me get the wrench on there. There we go. Okay. So the rotor's mounted. So I'm ready to install the stator cover and the stator. And what I do is put it over and push up the brushes so they can slide over the slip rings. There we go. And then I line up the hole in the cover with the hole back here, and then run in one of the stator cover bolts with the wave washer. And then I do that and get the other two of them in there, so I've got the cover oriented properly with the holes. Now I hand tighten the stator cover bolts, and I watch this little edge here, the shiny aluminum, against the sleeve, and I want them to go in evenly all the way around, so I walk my way around a little bit at a time to pull the cover in evenly. Now you can see that the red is right up against the sleeve, and it's that way all the way around, so everybody's good. And then I use a very short handle ratchet to just gently snug up the bolts. Now it's time to attach the wires to the terminals on the stator cover. These are the brush wires. One of them has a brown wire, which is ground, and the other has black, which is power. And when you look at the terminals, you'll notice this terminal is not insulated, but this terminal is insulated. So that means the black, which is the power, goes on the insulated terminal, and the ground goes on the non-insulated terminal, because that's how the ground for the alternator is achieved on the rotor brushes. Then the yellow wire that comes here goes on the Y terminal, like that. And then these three wires, which are going from the diode board, connect here to the three spade terminals on the front of the cover. And this is the AC phases, the three phases. So they just slide on like that. Now in routing the AC phase wires, I don't want them to be caught on this metal edge, because the front engine cover mates on that edge and you'll cut through them. So I pull them over around the housing a bit like this, so when I put the front engine cover on, they're not going to get pinched. Now the other component that's under the front engine cover is the electronic ignition sensor. And Euromoto Electrics provides a remanufactured one of these, which are also known as a bean can, because it kind of looks like a can of beans. I think it's very nicely done. It includes the sealing O-ring and a brand new wire harness that goes to the bean can. Now I picked up as well the sub-harness that connects the bean can to the electronic ignition control unit, which is what mounts up on the frame. So I'll attach that to the harness when I install the bean can. This is the sub-harness that connects the electronic ignition center to the control unit. And this end connects to the sensor plug. Now it's got a little wire bail, and I found it was easier to thread this plug through the holes in the inner timing cover if I removed the bail. So if I use a screwdriver, I can push out one of the feet and then just pop it out like that. There's not a lot of clearance in here, so I push it through the loop in the battery plus cable, and then I'll run it through the hole in the inner timing cover. So I bring it through this hole and I'll leave it about like that because it doesn't need to be too long. Now this upper cable will fit in a slot in the grommet that the battery plus cable goes in. So I'll thread it, I'll pull the grommet out and I'll thread it through that hole, slide it back in, and then when I put the top engine cover on, it'll keep everything tight. Now I'm going to put the bail back on the plug. There's two little ears on the top, so it goes down like that. And if you just push it, they'll snap right in. Now one detail when you install the BeanCan is you'll see there's a slot here on the cam face. And you want to align the little ears on the ignition sensor so that when you put the can in, they're going to line up with that slot. So I'm ready to install the remanufactured BeanCan. I put a little oil on the O-ring. Now the cable and its plastic cover are going to go over to the right side, and then this just slides in to the hole where the cam shaft is, and then it's secured by the two Allen bolts, and there's a wave washer under the bolt head and a big flat washer, and they just go into the holes and I tighten them up. So I routed the wire around the alternator and back behind the other wires and then into the plug on the harness. Now the plug has some ears on it, so it only can plug one way into the harness plug. So it's all installed.